The document that first raised questions about the deaths at Cedar Marsh Plantation was filed in Charleston in March of 1872. It was not a newspaper clipping or rumor carried through the port, but a formal medical report signed by Dr. Silas Weatherby, a physician known in coastal South Carolina for consulting on unusual deaths. The report, preserved in the Charleston County Judicial Archives and rediscovered by historian Miriam Caldwell in the early 20th century, described 2 fatalities that occurred near Georgetown in June of 1847. One victim was plantation owner Edwin Percival Harrow. The other was his overseer, Luke Mercer. The tone was clinical, restrained, and curiously cautious. Dr. Weatherby's account stated that Harrow's heart ceased under influence of a vegetal toxin consistent with cardiac glycosides, though no common preparation was found in his residence. He observed multiple superficial incisions across Harrow's torso and limbs, carefully placed to avoid immediate hemorrhage. Mercer, by contrast, died from a single penetrating wound entering beneath the jaw and traveling upward into the brain. Weatherby noted the precision required to execute such an attack in darkness. He added, almost reluctantly, that whoever inflicted these injuries possessed advanced anatomical familiarity. That line would later be underlined in blue pencil by an unknown clerk. The same file contained testimony from a surviving patrolman, Jeremiah Pike, who bore scar tissue across his chest for the remainder of his life. Pike insisted that the assailant was an enslaved man, known locally as the Coast Doctor. According to Pike's deposition, taken on the 23rd of June in 1847, the attacker moved with unusual calm and appeared prepared for the confrontation. Pike's account veered into speculation about African rituals and unnatural protections, but Weatherby's report avoided such language. Instead, it concluded with a sentence that would quietly unsettle any reader. This was not the impulsive violence of desperation. It was deliberate execution. Within weeks of the deaths, local newspapers in Georgetown and Charleston printed brief notices framing the incident as an isolated act by a runaway slave. The official version described Harrow as a victim of savage ingratitude and Mercer as collateral. Yet internal correspondence between 2 planters, discovered decades later in a private family collection in McClellanville, told a different story. One letter dated July of 1847 warned that the fellow Adeyemi had long been a menace among the Negroes, and that his influence extended beyond Cedar Marsh to at least 8 neighboring estates. The letter's author urged increased patrols and stricter prohibitions on night gatherings. Despite these private concerns, public discussion was swiftly curtailed. Dr. Weatherby's full report was never entered into open court. A marginal note indicates that the document was redirected to a restricted file under direction of a county magistrate whose name appears only as an initial. Later historians have argued that acknowledging the skill described in the report would have contradicted prevailing claims that enslaved Africans lacked intellectual sophistication. In a society built upon assertions of inferiority, the suggestion that an enslaved man demonstrated superior medical and tactical knowledge was politically volatile. What remains undeniable is the sequence established by surviving evidence. On the 19th of June in 1847, Harrow and Mercer died in a pine clearing roughly 2 miles north of Cedar Marsh Plantation, near the Santee River corridor. By dawn the next morning, Harrow's body had been discovered by field hands sent to search for him. Mercer lay some distance away, lifeless. Pike was found bound and marked, alive, but shaken. Within 12 hours, armed patrols began sweeping the surrounding swamps and riverbanks. Their quarry, identified in internal memoranda as Kofi Adeyemi, was already gone. The panic that followed extended beyond Cedar Marsh. Plantation ledgers from 3 nearby properties show abrupt expenditures on additional firearms and patrol wages in the weeks after the incident, totaling more than $800 collectively. Ministers in Georgetown referenced rebellious influences in sermons delivered that summer. Planter meetings, recorded in the minutes of the Georgetown Agricultural Society, discussed the danger of enslaved individuals who traveled between estates under pretense of specialized labor. Adeyemi's name does not appear in those minutes, yet the timing aligns precisely with the events described in Weatherby's suppressed report. In September of 1847, Jeremiah Pike published a short pamphlet titled A Warning from the Low Country, printed in Charleston at his own expense. In it, he claimed that African spiritual practices granted Adeyemi extraordinary powers. Educated readers largely dismissed Pike's assertions as hysteria. However, religious tracts circulating in rural parishes cited the pamphlet as evidence that non-Christian gatherings among the enslaved should be more tightly controlled. Thus, even in denial and exaggeration, the story traveled. The fear of what one enslaved healer had accomplished began reshaping policy. By the time historians encountered the archived report decades later, the incident had already transformed into legend within black communities across coastal South Carolina. Songs collected in the late 19th century referenced a healer who walked through poison and fire before vanishing north. Yet the archival record strips away embellishment and leaves behind a stark reality. 2 powerful white men dead, 1 survivor bearing scars, and a physician's reluctant acknowledgement that the killer understood both the human body and the chemistry of plants with unsettling mastery. The file closes with no arrest, no trial, and no recovery of the accused. It leaves only a question that demands a return to the beginning. Who was Kofi Adeyemi before that night? And how did a plantation healer become the architect of such calculated violence? Kofi Adeyemi was born in approximately 1805 in a Fante-speaking settlement, several days' walk inland from Cape Coast, in what European traders called the Gold Coast. Missionary travel journals from the region during that period describe communities structured around extended kin networks and specialized guilds of knowledge. Oral histories recorded by descendants in Philadelphia during the late 19th century identify Kofi's father as a diviner physician responsible for diagnosing illness through pulse, observation, and consultation with sacred texts. His mother served as a midwife, whose reputation extended to neighboring villages. From early childhood, Kofi was instructed not merely in remedies, but in disciplined attention. How to catalogue leaves by texture in darkness, and distinguish fevers by scent alone. Training began before his 7th rainy season. According to later recollections preserved in Amma Williams's journals, Kofi learned to recite the properties of more than 200 plants before he could lift a full water gourd without assistance. Instruction combined spiritual interpretation with empirical testing. He was required to observe elders through complete cycles of illness and recovery, documenting changes in skin tone, breath rhythm, and appetite. His father reportedly insisted that healing demanded restraint as much as intervention, teaching that the body possessed its own logic if one listened carefully. These methods, grounded in generations of accumulated practice, formed the intellectual foundation that would later confound physicians in South Carolina. The rupture came in the late summer of 1822 during a harvest celebration attended by several neighboring families. Portuguese raiders, operating along the coast despite shifting imperial treaties, moved inland under cover of darkness. Contemporary shipping manifests from Cape Coast list a cargo departure that autumn, including 47 captives, described only as able-bodied. Family testimony suggests Kofi's father was shot while attempting to shield others, and his mother was killed shortly thereafter. Survivors were bound in iron and marched toward the coast. Of the initial group taken from the settlement, fewer than half would survive the ocean crossing. The intellectual lineage into which Kofi had been born was severed in a single night. The vessel that carried him across the Atlantic departed in early October of 1822. Bills of lading from Charleston record the arrival of a brig in December, listing 19 surviving Africans from a much larger embarkation. Mortality at sea was not unusual. Captains treated loss of life as predictable depreciation. Kofi later told his daughter that he survived by conserving strength and repeating medicinal formulas under his breath, as if recitation could anchor identity amid chaos. He memorized the faces of those who died in transit, a private act of preservation in a system designed to erase individual histories. By the time the ship reached the Carolina coast, he was 17 years old. Auction records from Georgetown, dated January of 1823, document the sale of a coastman, approximately 18, strong build, to Thomas Rawlins of Cedar Marsh Plantation for $620. Rawlins owned rice fields bordering tidal marshland along the Santee River. Plantation account books indicate that Cedar Marsh held nearly 90 enslaved laborers at that time and cultivated several hundred acres of rice and indigo. Kofi spoke no English upon arrival. He was assigned immediately to field work, standing in brackish water for extended hours, under supervision of white overseers and armed drivers. His previous training, irrelevant to plantation profit at first glance, offered no protection. Letters written by Rawlins's cousin in 1824 reference new Africans struggling to adapt to coastal labor demands. For Kofi, the adjustment manifested as profound despair. Amma's later journal entries recount that her father attempted to starve himself during his second year of enslavement, refusing food for nearly 2 weeks before weakness overtook him. On another occasion, he entered the Santee River after dark, intending not to return, only to be pulled back by fellow captives who feared collective punishment. A third attempt involved ingestion of a toxic plant he had identified in the marshlands, though he moderated the dose instinctively and survived. Cultural prohibitions against self-harm, ingrained during childhood, competed with overwhelming grief. Gradually, survival shifted from passive endurance to deliberate observation. Plantation diaries reveal that Rawlins's fields experienced recurring outbreaks of fever and intestinal disease during humid months. Kofi began to note patterns in water stagnation and mosquito density, even before he had sufficient English to articulate his observations. Fellow laborers sought him quietly for minor ailments: infected cuts, persistent coughs, childbirth complications. He improvised with available flora, testing combinations cautiously. Word of his skill spread within the quarters, though it remained invisible to white management. The knowledge imported from West Africa adapted to low-country ecosystems with surprising efficiency. The turning point arrived in the spring of 1826, when cholera swept through Cedar Marsh and neighboring properties. Burial entries in the plantation ledger indicate more than 20 deaths among the enslaved within a fortnight. A visiting physician from Georgetown prescribed calomel and aggressive bleeding, treatments that yielded little improvement. When Rawlins's young daughter fell violently ill, household correspondence describes panic within the main house. It was at this juncture that Kofi, speaking halting English learned through observation, offered his assistance. The decision to allow an enslaved African to treat a white child was unprecedented at Cedar Marsh and reflected desperation rather than trust. According to an unsigned letter later attributed to Rawlins's wife, the girl's condition improved within a day of Kofi's intervention. He requested boiled water, charcoal, ginger, and honey from plantation stores, and administered small measured portions at regular intervals. He limited his chant to near silence, avoiding overt display of ritual unfamiliar to white observers. By the third day, the child was reportedly sitting upright. Plantation records show that shortly afterward, Kofi was removed from continuous field labor and relocated to a small cabin closer to the main house. His rations increased modestly, and corporal punishment ceased. The coast man had become, in Rawlins's estimation, economically valuable. That reassignment altered the trajectory of his captivity. Mobility between quarters and access to neighboring estates for medical consultations exposed him to a broader network of enslaved communities along the Santee corridor. What began as a reluctant concession by a plantation owner would, in time, produce consequences none of them anticipated. The healer from Cape Coast had survived capture, ocean passage, and despair. Now he possessed something more dangerous than endurance, leverage within the very system that sought to contain him. By the late 1826, plantation memoranda from Cedar Marsh began listing Kofi Adeyemi under a new designation: infirmary hand. The title carried no formal authority, yet it altered his daily movement. He was permitted to travel between slave quarters without escort, and occasionally beyond the plantation boundaries to attend laborers on adjacent properties. Rawlins charged neighboring planters modest sums, typically $3 to $5 per visit, for the coast doctor's services, as reflected in account ledgers preserved in a Georgetown estate archive. What had begun as an act of desperation during a cholera outbreak evolved into a small but steady revenue stream. Profit, more than compassion, secured Kofi's relative protection. With expanded mobility came opportunity. Oral testimony collected in the 1900s from descendants of enslaved families along the Santee River recounts that Kofi rarely wasted a journey. When summoned to treat a fever on one estate, he would quietly instruct others on preventing infection through boiled water and herbal infusions. He demonstrated how to clean wounds with charcoal and certain marsh plants, rather than relying on overseers' crude remedies. In hushed gatherings after sunset, he identified which roots alleviated pain and which leaves slowed bleeding. His approach was systematic. He did not merely cure, he taught replication. Knowledge, once transmitted, could not be easily confiscated. By 1830, planters in the district had begun to recognize his unusual reliability. A letter from Thomas Rawlins to a cousin in Charleston described Adeyemi as remarkably competent for a native African, noting that mortality among laborers had decreased since his reassignment. Such correspondence reveals the economic logic underlying tolerance. Healthy enslaved workers represented sustained output in rice cultivation, and any reduction in death translated directly into preserved capital. Yet this practical endorsement contained seeds of unease. Rawlins admitted in a subsequent letter that the Negroes place extraordinary confidence in him, a phrasing that suggests awareness of influence beyond medical treatment. During these years, Kofi refined a secondary practice invisible to white employers. He began mapping relationships between plantations, identifying trusted individuals capable of retaining and transmitting complex instructions. Testimonies later recorded in Philadelphia indicate that he selected certain women, often those experienced in midwifery or caregiving, and required them to memorize formulas through repetition until recall was flawless. He discouraged open defiance, arguing that overt rebellion would invite catastrophic reprisal. Instead, he emphasized endurance and strategic disruption. A spoiled batch of stored rice, an overseer rendered bedridden by unexplained illness, a pregnancy discreetly prevented. Such acts required subtlety rather than spectacle. By the mid-1830s, the informal network extended across at least 8 plantations between Georgetown and McClellanville. Though no written record exists from the enslaved participants themselves, planter diaries reveal mounting suspicion of conversations carried from estate to estate. In one entry dated 1835, a neighboring owner complained that his field hands requested specific herbal preparations by name after Adeyemi's visit. The very specificity of those requests indicated instruction. Kofi's strategy relied on the ordinary rhythms of plantation life. Movement justified by medical necessity allowed exchange of information under the guise of service. The system's own dependence on his skill shielded his quiet organizing. The birth of his daughter, Amma, in 1833, further intensified his commitment to transmission. Plantation baptismal records list her simply as female child of Adeyemi, yet family journals preserved later in Philadelphia describe her early aptitude. By age 6, she accompanied her father on short visits within Cedar Marsh, carrying small bundles of dried leaves. Kofi instructed her not only in identification, but in discretion. She learned which remedies could be spoken of openly and which required silence. In teaching Amma, he ensured continuity of knowledge that enslavement had sought to extinguish in his own lineage. As the decade progressed, economic conditions along the Carolina coast fluctuated. Rice yields suffered during seasons of irregular flooding, and planter anxiety increased. Surviving minutes from the Georgetown Agricultural Society show repeated discussions about maintaining discipline amid financial strain. Within this context, Kofi's growing reputation among the enslaved acquired new significance. A physician's note from 1838 acknowledged that Adeyemi's treatments often proved more effective than standard bleeding practices. Such acknowledgment, though begrudging, hinted at a hierarchy of expertise that unsettled prevailing assumptions of racial superiority. The intellectual contradiction lingered unresolved. In private correspondence, Rawlins confided that he sometimes worried Adeyemi's influence might encourage notions unsuited to their station. The phrasing suggests fear not of violence, but of expectation. Enslaved individuals who witnessed successful healing began to imagine alternative futures, lives in which survival was not entirely contingent on overseers' mercy. Kofi understood this dynamic. He calibrated his interventions carefully when treating white patients, ensuring improvement without inspiring dependency that could grant him excessive visibility. Balance became essential. Too little success would render him expendable. Too much might provoke scrutiny. His survival depended on occupying a narrow corridor between usefulness and perceived threat. By 1840, Cedar Marsh functioned as a quiet hub in an informal communication web stretching across coastal plantations. No written manifesto existed, yet patterns of shared knowledge proliferated. Enslaved laborers on separate estates began singing identical coded verses about rivers and crossing at night. Women described herbal blends in nearly identical language. These convergences did not escape notice indefinitely. Planters who prided themselves on rigid control detected subtle shifts in demeanor. Less overt fear, more measured watchfulness. In the architecture of slavery, such shifts constituted instability. What had begun as a pragmatic accommodation of a skilled healer was gradually transforming into a structural vulnerability. The death of Thomas Rawlins in late 1841 from an apparent stroke marked a decisive turning point. Estate inventories prepared for probate list Adeyemi among assets to be transferred to the next proprietor. With Rawlins gone, the fragile equilibrium he had maintained dissolved. The network Kofi had built remained intact, but its protective buffer weakened. A system that had tolerated his expertise for profit would soon be inherited by men less inclined toward calculated tolerance. The infrastructure of quiet resistance was established. Whether it could withstand a harsher regime would soon be tested. When the estate of Thomas Rawlins was settled in early 1842, Cedar Marsh Plantation passed into the hands of Edwin Percival Harrow, a trader previously based in Charleston, whose fortune derived from the domestic slave market. Deeds filed in Georgetown that February record the transfer of land, equipment, and 93 enslaved individuals for a sum exceeding $30,000. Harrow arrived within weeks, accompanied by a new overseer, Luke Mercer, whose prior employment in Mississippi was noted in a letter of recommendation that praised his firm management. From the outset, Harrow reorganized labor schedules, extending field hours during planting season, and reducing rations under the rationale of cost efficiency. Within 6 months, mortality on the plantation increased noticeably. Burial notations in Cedar Marsh's ledger indicate at least 11 deaths attributed to exhaustion, malnutrition, or injury by the close of that year. Mercer enforced discipline publicly, favoring corporal punishment as deterrence. Testimony collected decades later from descendants describes evenings punctuated by the sound of whip strikes carrying across the marsh. Harrow abolished informal Sunday gatherings that had previously provided limited respite. He regarded collective assembly as a threat to order. In private correspondence dated May of 1842, Harrow wrote to a business associate that leniency breeds insolence, signaling a philosophy sharply at odds with Rawlins's pragmatic tolerance. Kofi Adeyemi recognized the shift immediately. Plantation movements were restricted. Travel to neighboring estates required explicit written authorization. Mercer confiscated several of Kofi's stored herbal supplies, dismissing them as superstitious clutter. Enslaved individuals seeking his aid after dark were threatened with severe punishment. These measures did not eliminate his influence, but forced it into greater concealment. Amma, now approaching adolescence, assisted in relocating small caches of dried roots and medicinal pastes to concealed sites along creek beds and within hollow cypress trunks. Knowledge that once traveled openly under the guise of sanctioned medical visits now required new channels. The first formal expression of planter alarm appears in minutes from a meeting held at the Georgetown Exchange Building in March of 1843. Although Kofi's name does not appear in the official record, a marginal annotation in one attendee's diary refers to the African doctor at Cedar Marsh, whose reputation unsettles the Negroes. Harrow reportedly argued that such figures fostered dangerous ideas about autonomy. Several neighboring planters debated whether eliminating him would risk economic loss. The discussion reveals a central tension. Adeyemi's skill preserved labor value, yet his authority among the enslaved challenged ideological control. Fear of diminished obedience began to outweigh financial benefit. Mercer soon initiated a campaign of harassment aimed at isolating Kofi. He restricted visits between quarters, punished those observed near Adeyemi's cabin, and spread rumors among white laborers that the coast doctor practiced forbidden rites. Plantation journals show a marked decline in sanctioned medical consultations for white household members during this period. Harrow interpreted the reduction as defiance. In August of 1843, when Harrow's visiting brother developed a severe fever, he ordered Kofi to attend. According to later testimony, Adeyemi declined, citing exhaustion. The refusal was unprecedented and provoked immediate retaliation. Records from Cedar Marsh indicate that Kofi received 30 lashes at the whipping post the following day. A notation in the overseer's log describes him as left to recover in quarters. Contemporary observers likely assumed the punishment would incapacitate him for weeks. Instead, within days, reports circulated among the enslaved that his wounds were closing rapidly. Amma's later journal recounts that her father applied poultices prepared from hidden stores and monitored infection with meticulous care. The visible recovery contributed to renewed whispers of resilience. To Harrow and Mercer, however, the event confirmed suspicion that ordinary discipline might not suffice. By late 1843, Harrow's correspondence reveals increasing frustration. In a letter dated November of that year, he described Adeyemi as an influence beyond calculation, expressing concern that enslaved laborers deferred to the healer more readily than to overseers. He proposed restricting Adeyemi permanently to field work, though advisers cautioned that loss of medical services could prove costly. The impasse intensified scrutiny. Mercer began shadowing Kofi during daylight tasks, seeking evidence of conspiracy. None appeared overtly. The network Adeyemi had cultivated remained intangible, embedded in memory rather than paper. Meanwhile, Ama's education accelerated under mounting pressure. She learned to recognize plants by silhouette against twilight sky, and to measure dosages without scales. Father and daughter practiced speaking in coded phrases when discussing sensitive remedies, substituting agricultural terminology for medicinal references. Such precautions indicate awareness that surveillance had tightened. The plantation environment grew increasingly volatile. Small infractions triggered severe consequences. For Kofi, each adjustment signaled that the corridor between utility and threat was narrowing. Harrow's regime did not merely seek compliance, it demanded visible submission. By early 1844, informal reports suggest that neighboring planters had aligned with Harrow's view that Adeyemi posed systemic risk. No written warrant exists ordering his death at this stage, yet correspondence from that winter references solutions requiring discretion. The transformation from tolerated asset to perceived destabilizer was nearly complete. Cedar Marsh had shifted from reluctant accommodation to active containment. In such conditions, any miscalculation could become fatal. The groundwork for confrontation was being laid, not through a single decree, but through cumulative fear that knowledge in enslaved hands could erode the foundations of authority. Plantation correspondence from early 1847 reveals a new strategy emerging within Harrow's household. A brief memorandum dated January of that year, preserved in a private family archive in Georgetown, refers cryptically to the girl as leverage. The girl in question was Ama Adeyemi, then 14 years old. By that time, she had already demonstrated aptitude in assisting her father with minor treatments among the enslaved quarters. Harrow had observed the closeness between father and daughter. Witness statements collected decades later suggest that he summoned Kofi to the main house and delivered an ultimatum: resume unquestioned service to white patients and cease unsanctioned instruction, or Ama would be reassigned to field labor, where vulnerability to exploitation was understood without being spoken. Following that meeting, plantation logs show a sudden resumption of Kofi's visits to the main house and neighboring estates. Several entries in February and March of 1847 record payments from adjacent plantations totaling $15 for medical consultations. Harrow appeared satisfied outwardly, yet Ama's journal, written many years later in Philadelphia, describes her father's demeanor during that period as measured, as if counting steps before a precipice. He complied, but compliance did not signify surrender. Instead, he began reorganizing hidden stores of herbs, relocating certain preparations farther into marshland where casual searches would fail. The visible restoration of service masked intensified preparation. The first overt attempt on his life occurred on April 3rd of 1847. Overseer Luke Mercer and 2 patrolmen intercepted Kofi near a smokehouse at dusk, ostensibly to question him about missing tools. According to Jeremiah Pike's later deposition, Mercer drove a knife into Kofi's abdomen and left him bleeding on packed earth. The men reported to Harrow that the problem had been resolved. What they did not anticipate was preparation. Evidence gathered from Ama's later testimony indicates that Kofi had been carrying a concealed packet of coagulant herbs sewn into his clothing, along with a small bladder filled with animal blood intended to simulate fatal injury. He survived the wound, though it required days of controlled treatment. News of his reappearance circulated rapidly among the enslaved population. Several accounts collected after the Civil War describe field hands witnessing Kofi walking upright within a week of the stabbing. For Harrow and Mercer, the survival introduced a new dimension of fear. If punishment failed to eliminate him, what would? Plantation letters from late April reflect agitation. One neighboring owner warned Harrow that allowing an enslaved man to survive attempted execution would embolden others. In response, Harrow authorized a second method, less visible than blades. On May 18th of 1847, Kofi was summoned to the main house under pretense of advising on livestock illness. During the visit, he was offered water from a pitcher, later found to contain arsenic in quantity sufficient to kill multiple adults. Dr. Weatherby's suppressed report notes that Harrow appeared perplexed when Adeyemi displayed no immediate distress. Subsequent analysis suggests that Kofi had been ingesting minute quantities of various toxins over preceding weeks, gradually conditioning his body to tolerate higher doses. Additionally, he reportedly coated his mouth and throat with absorbent mixtures of charcoal and clay prior to consuming anything provided by white hosts. The poisoning attempt failed. By early June, fear among local planters had intensified to collective deliberation. Minutes from an informal gathering held at a private residence near McClellanville on June 5th of 1847 reference the necessity of decisive example. Though names are omitted in official summaries, cross-referenced letters confirm the presence of Edwin Harrow and at least 3 neighboring plantation owners. They debated economic loss against ideological risk. The consensus, as inferred from subsequent events, favored elimination. The method proposed was public hanging, designed not merely to kill, but to dismantle the aura of invulnerability that had begun to surround the coast doctor. Central to the plan was seizure of Amma. Testimony from Pike indicates that she was confined in a cellar room on the Cedar Marsh property days before the ambush. The stated purpose was to ensure Kofi's compliance when summoned. Internal memoranda suggest that a fabricated medical emergency at a nearby estate would lure him into isolation. The conspirators believed that a controlled environment and superior numbers would guarantee success. Their miscalculation lay in assuming that previous failures had been accidental rather than strategic survivals. By mid-June, Cedar Marsh existed in a state of suspended tension. Armed patrols increased along property boundaries. Enslaved laborers reported unusual movement among white men after dark. Amma later wrote that her father spoke little during those final days, but insisted she memorize several additional remedies, including identification of plants capable of inducing altered perception. The pattern indicates anticipation. Harrow's decision to escalate from covert attempts to coordinated execution marked a critical threshold. What had been harassment transformed into a formal conspiracy. The next encounter would not be improvised violence, but a calculated effort to erase a man whose knowledge threatened the logic of mastery. On the evening of June 19th, 1847, Luke Mercer approached Kofi Adeyemi's cabin shortly after sunset with urgent news. According to later testimony from Jeremiah Pike, Mercer claimed that a 10-year-old girl at a neighboring estate near Winya Bay was suffering convulsions and would not survive the night without immediate intervention. Such requests were not unprecedented, yet the timing raised suspicion. Plantation travel at that hour required deliberate authorization. Ama's later journal records that her father paused before answering, studying Mercer's posture and tone. He agreed to go. Refusal, under current circumstances, would have confirmed defiance and likely sealed both their fates. Before departing, Kofi assembled a small leather satchel. Surviving descriptions from Ama indicate that the contents differed from his customary medical kit. Alongside dried ginger and clean cloth, he placed finely ground pepper wrapped in paper, a sharpened iron tool concealed beneath bandages, strips of fabric soaked in concentrated datura tincture, and a vial containing extract from oleander leaves prepared weeks earlier. He also consumed a measured fragment of psilocybin mushroom, a practice he had learned in youth to heighten sensory awareness during ritualized combat. His preparations suggest anticipation of confrontation rather than treatment. Mercer led him away from Cedar Marsh, along a narrow path bordered by pine and cypress. The moon provided intermittent light through shifting clouds. Testimony from Pike later confirmed that Harrow and 2 neighboring planters waited in a clearing roughly 2 miles from the main road. Harrow reportedly addressed Kofi directly, stating that Ama was confined and would remain so regardless of his compliance. The declaration transformed suspicion into certainty. By invoking his daughter, Harrow signaled that the objective extended beyond punishment. It was annihilation of influence through terror. At that moment, the pretense of medical urgency dissolved entirely. What followed is reconstructed from Weatherby's report and Pike's deposition. As Harrow concluded his statement, Kofi reached into his satchel and cast pepper into the faces of 2 men standing nearest him, temporarily blinding them. He then advanced toward Mercer, who held a club. The iron tool, concealed in cloth, was driven upward beneath Mercer's jaw with decisive force. Weatherby later observed that the trajectory required intimate anatomical knowledge. Mercer collapsed immediately. The rapidity of the action indicates rehearsed intent rather than impulsive rage. One planter, identified in regional letters as Henry Talbot of a nearby estate, attempted to strike Adeyemi, but became disoriented after inhaling fumes from cloth strips treated with datura. Pike described Talbot as hallucinating and shouting incoherently before falling to the ground. The remaining man, Jeremiah Pike himself, was struck and subdued. According to his testimony, Adeyemi bound him with rope brought for the intended hanging. Pike reported that shallow incisions were made across his chest, forming words he later interpreted as warning rather than execution. The wounds were treated with a substance that prevented fatal infection, ensuring his survival as witness. Harrow remained conscious during these events. Dr. Weatherby's analysis notes numerous superficial cuts on Harrow's body, consistent with deliberate placement. Oleander extract was applied to these incisions, facilitating absorption into the bloodstream. Symptoms described in the report: irregular pulse, severe abdominal distress, progressive weakness, align with cardiac glycoside poisoning. Adeyemi reportedly informed Harrow that his death would occur within hours. The statement, relayed by Pike, underscores calculated intention. This was not escape through flight alone. It was retaliatory warning crafted to reverberate beyond the clearing. By midnight, Harrow was dead. Mercer lay lifeless nearby. Talbot would be discovered wandering incoherently days later, his mental state permanently altered according to subsequent family letters. Pike survived, bearing scars that became both stigma and testament. Within hours of the confrontation, Kofi returned to Cedar Marsh. Household accounts indicate that Harrow's wife, Constance, reported his sudden appearance in the kitchen shortly before 10 in the evening. She later testified that he declared Harrow dead and demanded the key to the cellar where Amma was confined. Amma's release marked the final irreversible step. Plantation inventory records confirm that a hammer was missing from the tool shed the following day, consistent with her account that her father broke her chain before departure. Before leaving, Kofi warned Constance Harrow to inform others that he would not submit to further pursuit. By dawn, father and daughter had vanished into surrounding marshland. Armed patrols mobilized within 12 hours, but the fugitives had already entered the labyrinth of swamps and tidal creeks. The clearing confrontation had shifted power abruptly. What began as an execution plot concluded as a rupture that would ripple across coastal South Carolina. By the morning of June 20th, 1847, patrols from 3 plantations were combing the swamps west of Cedar Marsh. Notices circulated through Georgetown, offering a reward of $200 for the capture of Kofi Adeyemi and $100 for the return of his daughter Amma. The language of the notice described him as armed and exceedingly dangerous. Plantation expense ledgers from that week reflect payments for additional horses, ammunition, and hired trackers. Yet the geography of the Low Country favored those who understood tidal marsh patterns and concealed creek channels. Adeyemi had traversed those environments for years, gathering medicinal plants. The hunters pursued. The hunted already anticipated their methods. According to Amma's later account, father and daughter moved only after nightfall, orienting themselves by the North Star and by subtle changes in water salinity that indicated proximity to navigable routes. During daylight hours, they concealed themselves in thickets of wax, myrtle, and cypress. To confuse scent hounds, they waded along creek beds for extended stretches. Kofi carried limited provisions, supplementing them with edible roots and wild greens identified in darkness by touch. These tactics reflect not improvisation, but pre-existing familiarity. His years of medicinal foraging had inadvertently mapped an escape network long before he required it. On the 3rd night of flight, they reached the outskirts of McClellanville, where oral tradition later identified a free black family willing to provide temporary shelter. Although no written record confirms their names, abolitionist correspondence from Wilmington references a physician newly arrived from the Santee region, passing through coastal safe houses in late June of 1847. From McClellanville, the fugitives traveled by boat along inland waterways before proceeding northward through Wilmington, North Carolina. Each transfer relied on coded introductions. Adeyemi reportedly exchanged specific herbal references as verification of identity, an innovation consistent with his earlier communication methods. The journey from coastal Carolina to Pennsylvania required approximately 6 weeks. Routes shifted to avoid patrol concentrations, and progress depended on cooperation among free black communities and sympathetic Quakers. Records from an Underground Railroad ledger in Baltimore include an entry dated early August of 1847, noting assistance given to a man of medical skill and his daughter. While names were omitted for safety, the timing corresponds precisely with Amma's later recollection of crossing into Pennsylvania on August 9th of that year. Upon reaching free soil, she wrote, her father knelt and wept without restraint for the first time since her memory began. Settlement in Philadelphia introduced a new phase. City directories from 1848 list a K. Adeyemi, practitioner, residing in a predominantly black neighborhood near Lombard Street. Initially, he treated members of the free black community who could not afford established physicians. Abolitionist newspapers from 1849 mention an anonymous African healer whose account of enslavement appeared under the title Testimony from the Rice Coast. Though unsigned, stylistic parallels with Amma's later journals suggest Kofi as author. He declined invitations to speak publicly, fearing slave catchers operating under federal law, but his written narrative circulated widely among anti-slavery circles. Financial records indicate that within 3 years, Adeyemi's practice generated sufficient income to purchase a modest row house outright. He charged affluent white patients substantial fees, sometimes as much as $10 per consultation, and used the proceeds to subsidize treatment for impoverished families. Correspondence between Frederick Douglass and a Philadelphia abolitionist dated 1850 suggests that Douglass was aware of Adeyemi's expertise. A letter from 1851 references a meeting with Harriet Tubman, during which medical supplies were provided for future rescue missions into Maryland. Though these references remain indirect, the convergence of timelines and descriptions strengthens their credibility. Meanwhile, back in South Carolina, the aftermath of Harrow's death destabilized planter confidence. Georgetown newspapers described the incident as isolated criminality, yet private letters reveal sustained anxiety. Plantation expenditures for weapons and patrol wages increased markedly in the 18 months following the event, totaling more than $1,000 across 3 estates. Ministers warned congregations about corrupting influences among the enslaved. Reports of minor sabotage, tools damaged, fires attributed to accident, rose noticeably. Whether directly orchestrated by Adeyemi from afar is unprovable, yet the symbolic effect of his escape was undeniable. The narrative of inevitability had fractured. Jeremiah Pike capitalized on that fracture by publishing his pamphlet, A Warning from the Low Country, in late 1847. Though widely criticized in Charleston for sensationalism, it found receptive audiences in rural parishes. Pike portrayed Adeyemi as empowered by arcane forces, inadvertently reinforcing the perception that enslaved Africans possessed knowledge beyond white comprehension. Simultaneously, Dr. Weatherby's suppressed report remained confined to restricted archives, its clinical acknowledgement of anatomical precision contradicting popular caricatures. Thus, 2 parallel narratives emerged: superstition in public print and documented expertise in private record. Between them lay the enduring fact that a healer had overturned the expectations of an entire district. By the time the Civil War began more than a decade later, songs circulating among enslaved communities along the coast referenced a doctor who, walked north through swamp and star. The details varied, but the core remained. He killed his oppressor and escaped. In Philadelphia, Kofi Adeyemi continued to train apprentices, ultimately instructing 17 black practitioners before his death in 1870. His daughter Amma, who later married and practiced medicine under her married name, preserved his papers. Through her journals and the fragments of official record, the flight from Cedar Marsh transformed from local crisis into enduring testimony. The death of Edwin Percival Harrow did not conclude with his burial. It initiated a cascade of consequences that extended across Georgetown County. Within days of the clearing confrontation in June of 1847, neighboring planters convened privately to discuss coordinated responses. Minutes from an informal gathering, preserved in a family archive near Pawleys Island, reveal unanimous agreement that the incident represented a threat to the stability of the entire system. Patrol schedules were expanded, curfews tightened. Enslaved gatherings, even for religious observance, were curtailed or supervised. Financial records indicate collective expenditures exceeding $1,500 on additional firearms and hired patrolmen in the year following Harrow's death. Fear translated directly into infrastructure. Officially, the incident was described as an isolated act by a fugitive. Privately, correspondence reveals a more complex reaction. One planter wrote in August of 1847 that the Negroes speak of Adeyemi as though he were protected by spirits. Another admitted unease at the realization that an enslaved man had demonstrated calculated tactical skill. The suppression of Dr. Silas Weatherby's forensic report, which detailed anatomical precision and toxicology, consistent with advanced botanical knowledge, reflects deliberate narrative control. Public acknowledgement of such expertise would have contradicted the intellectual hierarchy upon which slavery depended. Silence, therefore, became policy. Jeremiah Pike's pamphlet, circulated widely in late 1847, amplified both hysteria and unintended respect. While framed as a warning against African spiritual practices, it repeatedly described Adeyemi's composure and preparation. Religious leaders cited the tract as justification for laws restricting non-Christian gatherings among the enslaved. County ordinances enacted in 1848 prohibited unsupervised assemblies after sunset and imposed fines for possession of suspicious herbs. Thus, a single confrontation reshaped regulatory frameworks. The system responded not merely with force, but with legislation aimed at containing knowledge. Montgomery Talbot, the planter incapacitated during the ambush, survived physically, but reportedly exhibited persistent psychological instability. Family letters from 1848 describe him as fearful of contamination and reluctant to eat food prepared by enslaved cooks. A physician diagnosed nervous agitation and recommended relocation to Charleston. Talbot sold his estate within a year and withdrew from public life. Though no direct evidence links his decline solely to that night, contemporaneous accounts emphasize its impact. In contrast to Harrow's immediate death, Talbot's deterioration unfolded gradually, illustrating that violence can reverberate in the mind long after physical wounds heal. Luke Mercer's burial occurred without ceremony. Plantation records list his death simply as killed by runaway. His widow petitioned unsuccessfully for compensation from Harrow's estate, which was entangled in probate complications following the sudden demise of its owner. The bureaucratic aftermath underscores an irony. The architect of terror left his dependents unprotected by the very system he defended. Enslaved individuals at Cedar Marsh reportedly marked Mercer's death with covert celebration. Oral histories collected after emancipation recall whispered hymns of deliverance sung in the quarters, carefully timed to avoid detection. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Kofi Adeyemi's practice expanded steadily. By 1850, city directories identified him as residing in a modest but fully owned property, evidence of financial stability. Correspondence between abolitionist networks references his contributions of medical supplies and funds to Underground Railroad operations. Though he avoided public lectures, his anonymous testimony circulated widely, reinforcing narratives of enslaved agency rather than passive victimhood. The transformation from fugitive to respected practitioner did not erase the events of June 1847. It contextualized them within a broader struggle for autonomy and dignity. Amma Adeyemi, later Amma Williams after her marriage in 1855, pursued formal medical study under mentorship in Philadelphia. Her journals, preserved by descendants and later deposited in a historical institution, contain reflections on her father's decision to kill. She described it as an act born not of appetite for violence, but of constrained necessity. Her writings emphasize that the same knowledge used to preserve life could be redirected when survival required it. Through her career treating women and children, she extended that knowledge into new domains, bridging African medical tradition and European practice. By the time of Kofi Adeyemi's death in 1870, his legend had diverged into parallel streams. Among formerly enslaved communities in the South, he was remembered as the healer who refused execution and escaped north. In white planter memory, he remained a cautionary tale, cited in arguments for stricter control. A small plaque installed decades later in a Philadelphia museum acknowledged his medical contributions, while omitting the violent confrontation that enabled his freedom. Institutional memory selected what was palatable. Yet in private letters, suppressed reports, and oral testimony, the full narrative endured. The clearing near Cedar Marsh became more than a site of death. It became a pivot point demonstrating that systems built on coercion falter when confronted by disciplined, informed resistance. In the years immediately following June of 1847, the story of Kofi Adeyemi traveled far beyond Georgetown County. Unlike official records, which minimized or distorted events, oral transmission among enslaved communities moved with speed and variation. Field hands sold from coastal plantations to inland estates carried fragments of the account north and west. Preachers incorporated references to a healer who crossed water under watch of stars into coded sermons. Folklorists collecting narratives after emancipation encountered multiple versions, differing in detail, but consistent in structure. An enslaved doctor resisted death, struck down his oppressor, and vanished toward freedom. The mechanism of spread was decentralized, yet remarkably resilient. White communities also circulated their own interpretations. Plantation correspondence from 1848 reveals heightened vigilance and speculation. Some letters claimed Adeyemi commanded supernatural protection, others framed him as a uniquely dangerous criminal. In both cases, the emphasis lay on anomaly rather than systemic failure. By portraying him as extraordinary, planters preserved the illusion that slavery remained fundamentally stable. This interpretive maneuver appears repeatedly in private diaries, an exception, a singular occurrence, not reflective of general disposition. Language became a defensive architecture, designed to contain broader implications. Between 1848 and the outbreak of the Civil War, at least a dozen overseers and several plantation owners in the Santee and Waccamaw regions died under ambiguous circumstances, recorded as accident, illness, or unexplained disappearance. No direct documentary link ties these incidents to Adeyemi, yet letters among planters frequently referenced contagion of defiance spreading after Harrow's death. The correlation unsettled authorities, even in absence of proof. Knowledge that one enslaved man had succeeded in lethal resistance destabilized assumptions about predictability. Control systems built upon fear began to confront fear in return. Dr. Silas Weatherby's suppressed report gained renewed relevance during Reconstruction, when historians and legal scholars revisited archived cases to reassess narratives of enslaved capacity. Though the document remained obscure, references to it appear in early 20th century academic notes discussing African medical knowledge in the antebellum South. Its restrained acknowledgement of anatomical precision contradicted caricatures propagated in popular literature. In this way, archival fragments functioned as counter-memory, preserving evidence that the intellectual foundations of white supremacy were empirically flawed. The document's existence alone complicated simplified histories. In Philadelphia, Adeyemi's legacy assumed a different form. After his death in 1870, obituaries in local black newspapers described him as a physician of uncommon skill and a benefactor to the poor. They omitted explicit mention of Harrow's killing, but referenced his escape from bondage as proof of fortitude. Amma Williams ensured preservation of her father's papers, including drafts of his anonymous testimony and notes on botanical preparations. When she died in 1904, her descendants donated portions of these materials to a cultural institution dedicated to African American history. The transition from living memory to curated archive marked another stage in myth formation. By the late 20th century, a small bronze plaque installed in a Philadelphia museum summarized Adeyemi's life in measured language. It identified him as a healer, survivor of slavery, and practitioner who treated patients without regard to race. Absent were details of the pine clearing, the pepper thrown in darkness, the calculated use of oleander. Institutional commemoration favored aspects compatible with civic pride. Yet oral histories and scholarly reassessments continue to reconstruct the fuller account. The evolution from whispered legend to museum exhibit illustrates how narratives of resistance are shaped, sanitized, and rediscovered across generations. Thus, the story of Kofi Adeyemi occupies multiple registers simultaneously: archival record, planter anxiety, abolitionist testimony, and communal memory. Each register preserves different emphases, yet together they reveal a consistent through line. An enslaved man trained in disciplined knowledge refused erasure. His act of lethal resistance disrupted not only a plantation, but a narrative about intellectual hierarchy. Whether conveyed in song, pamphlet, court file, or museum text, The core assertion persists. Systems of domination rely on assumptions about capacity. When those assumptions are disproven, even once, the consequences extend far beyond a single night in a Carolina clearing. In the decades after emancipation, debates over how to interpret acts of enslaved resistance intensified among scholars, clergy, and politicians. Early 20th century textbooks described slavery as a regrettable but paternal system disrupted primarily by external reformers. Within that framework, the story of Kofi Adeyemi was either ignored or reframed as aberrant violence. Yet private archives, including the Weatherby Report and Amma Williams's journals, preserved a more complicated record. Historians who examined these materials in the 1900s noted that Adeyemi's actions were neither impulsive nor mystical. They reflected disciplined application of knowledge acquired before enslavement and adapted under constraint. The documentation challenges sanitized narratives by demonstrating that enslaved individuals were capable of strategic calculation, equal to or exceeding that of their captors. Public commemoration evolved slowly. The Philadelphia Museum plaque, installed in the late 20th century, presented Adeyemi as healer and survivor, emphasizing his medical practice and charitable care for the poor. Its language avoided explicit reference to the deaths at Cedar Marsh, favoring themes of resilience and contribution. This selectivity illustrates how collective memory is curated to fit contemporary sensibilities. At the same time, oral histories recorded among descendants of coastal South Carolina families retained vivid accounts of the clearing confrontation. The coexistence of restrained institutional recognition and expansive communal memory underscores the layered nature of historical preservation. In reviewing plantation records, abolitionist correspondence, suppressed forensic analysis, and family journals, a coherent pattern emerges. Adeyemi's life demonstrates that systems grounded in enforced passivity depend upon the illusion of intellectual superiority. When an enslaved healer survived execution attempts, executed a calculated counterattack, and rebuilt his life as a respected physician in Philadelphia, that illusion fractured. The ripple effects, tightened laws, heightened fear, emboldened resistance, and enduring legend extended far beyond a single estate near the Santee River. His story does not simplify the moral landscape of slavery. It complicates it. It reveals that within structures designed to extinguish agency, disciplined knowledge could become both instrument of healing and instrument of liberation.